Good morning, everyone. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us. For those of you who are aware of Council Town Hall, we have pivoted from our in-person programming to providing you with these live streams featuring the most compelling national, international, and regional experts on the most timely issues. But we can't do this without your support. Please consider becoming a member of the council or by making a contribution by going to our website at lawac.org. We can't do this without you. And for all of you who have been joining as members this past month and making contributions, on behalf of the staff and myself, we thank you with all our heart. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's program on how Caltech and JPL are tackling a pandemic, with Dr. Thomas Rosenbaum, President of Caltech and Professor of Physics, Pamela Bjorkman, Caltech Professor of Biology and Bioengineering, Paul Wennberg, Caltech Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry, Environmental Science and Engineering, and Dave Gallagher, Associate Director of Strategic Integration at NASA JPL. To our panelists and Dr. Rosenbaum, thank you so much for joining this. Dr. Rosenbaum, I turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. Really appreciate the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall hosting this event. This has been a tumultuous time, and like most academic institutions and many businesses, Caltech almost overnight transitioned to remote instruction and to remote operations. The one big exception has been research to understand the science of the coronavirus pandemic and to seek treatments and vaccines. What Caltech does best is to approach important problems from many directions, marshaling insights from a diverse set of disciplines. COVID-19 research on campus and at JPL, which Caltech founded and runs for NASA, has brought together biologists, chemists, engineers, environmental scientists, physicists, and social scientists, all united in the quest to translate fundamental scientific insights into interventions that improve people's lives. As Kim mentioned, joining me today are Pamela Bjorkman, Caltech's David Baltimore Professor of Biology and Bioengineering, David Gallagher, the Associate Director for Strategic Integration at JPL, and Paul Wennberg, the R. Stanton Avery Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Environmental Science and Engineering, and the Director of the Lind Center for Global Environmental Science. Thank you all for being here. I thought we'd start with a question to all of you. So please jump in as you think about this. When the coronavirus hit, did you know immediately that you needed to change direction? And how did you do that? How were you able to pivot?
I'll be happy to start, Tom. Thank you, and thank you for including me on the panel. At JPL, as I think most of you know, we build spacecraft. That's our primary job, and our pivot really came in the way of shutting down everybody on a campus of about 6,500 people to the bare minimum who are required to work on spacecraft. We then had a small group of very passionate engineers and scientists who were so upset about what was going on and what they saw on the front lines, they decided to build a ventilator. So that's sort of, I won't go into a lot more detail now, but that's kind of the pivot that happened at JPL.
Yeah, we were instantly interested in understanding how we might use this, what I call big unnatural experiment, to learn more about how humans impact the environment. So we spun up a very quick study using the Caltech's Keck Institute for Space Studies to try to learn what observations we could make right now that would allow us to take advantage of this opportunity. In my own lab, we had assembled a whole set of air quality instruments that we quickly moved up to the roof of the building in order to understand the local impacts on air quality.
And my lab had been studying the immune responses to viruses using structural biology for a long time, and we were mainly focusing on HIV, some Zika virus, hepatitis C, influenza, and so on. And in, I'd say, late January, it became really obvious from everything I read that this was going to be bad. And so we switched over what we were doing to focus on SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19 disease.
That's great. Well, Pamela, maybe I can follow up there because as you point out, January was very early and your lab was one of the first to respond. But vaccines are notoriously difficult to create. They typically take years, sometimes decades. In fact, for AIDS, we don't have a vaccine yet, to go from the bench design to market. Is there a biological basis for being more optimistic about the vaccine for SARS-CoV-2?
I really think there is, because we and other labs, like you say, have been working on a possible vaccine for HIV infection for decades. And this is incredibly hard because there are so many different strains of HIV. It's estimated there's 10 to the 16th different strains. And so it's very hard to imagine what you could inject. Influenza virus is also quite variable. The coronaviruses, which cause either SARS, MERS, or the present COVID-19 disease, and the common cold coronaviruses are much less variable. I think it's a lot more promising that people could very quickly get a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2 infection. I'm a lot more optimistic about this than about these other more variable viruses. It's a question of manufacturability and so on, and getting billions of doses around the world. That's going to be the challenge. But I think biologically, it should be possible to make a vaccine.
Wow, well, that's very encouraging. In fact, last week, there was significant media attention paid to the Moderna vaccine. This sort of vaccine, you have said, has the potential to be developed more rapidly. Why is that?
Well, the Moderna vaccine is actually not the traditional vaccines that we get, like against influenza, are sometimes inactivated flu viruses. So the flu virus material, or sometimes they are protein subunits of the flu virus. And these are difficult to manufacture in the type of way that you need to actually inject into someone. The Moderna vaccine is a form of the genetic message for one of the SARS-CoV-2 proteins, the so-called spike or S protein. It's a messenger RNA. They put it in some kind of lipid nanoparticle, and that apparently is much faster to make. So they were just immediately ready. All they had to do, they had this mRNA, messenger RNA platform set up at their company to make different types of viral proteins. They switched in the sequence for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein as soon as it was available, and it was available really quickly from labs from China, and then they were ready to go. So that's gone through phase 1 trials. It appears to be safe. It actually appears, at least in a few people, phase 1 trials are small. It's tolerated, and it appears to induce the kind of antibodies you want, which are neutralizing antibodies, meaning they would block infection. So whether or not it induces the, high enough quantities of neutralizing antibodies, if they last long enough, and so on, all this remains to be determined. But I think it looks really promising, and that type of technology allowed them to go much faster than normal.
Yeah. How is your lab exploring this area?
Well, we're looking at structures of neutralizing antibodies bound to the spike protein I just referred to from SARS-CoV-2 using cryo-electron microscopy. And so we're trying to figure out what makes something neutralized, what makes it not neutralizing, and so on. And what we would hope to do with that information is either take the antibodies that exist. These are isolated by our collaborator, Michelle Nusenswag at Rockefeller University. They're isolated from COVID-19 individuals, people who've had COVID-19 disease, tested positive for it, and have now recovered. And so they isolate those antibodies. We look at them structurally, and then I think we could improve them to make them work at much higher concentrations, to do fancy tricks so that they would be more efficacious in a person, to change them so that they could, if there's a possibility of causing harm, we could remove those possibilities and so on. That's one way. Another thing we're really trying to work on is that we and others recognize this is not going to be the last coronavirus that passes over from bats or other animals into people. And so what we need is a vaccine that would work against anything that's emerging. There are hundreds of coronaviruses in bats now that have already been sequenced, and some of them appear in people. They just haven't caused pandemics yet. So we'd like to make a so-called universal vaccine that would work against any type of coronavirus that is that might emerge at some point in the future. And I want to point out that, of course, this is the third one in this century. We had SARS in the early 2000s, we had MERS in 2012, and now we have this one. And so I think we're going to have more. We need to have some way of not exactly predicting what virus is going to come out, but being prepared for whatever virus that does emerge. And so we think that using structural biology to look at exactly what the antibodies do, we can figure out how to raise them. And so that's what we're doing in vaccine design.
Well, thank you, Pamela. And I think this long-term view is just essential, and we hope that the focus of scientists and government support will continue in that way to protect our society. I wanted to switch now to the great natural experiment we're doing in terms of pollution and ask Paul for some of his comments. We've talked about how the scientific community has mobilized research to respond to SARS-CoV-2, but we've also experienced a marked slowdown at the same time in industrial activity, physical movement of individuals across the globe. So from an environmental perspective, Paul, what are some of the most significant effects you've seen from the drastically reduced carbon emission from cars, planes, and manufacturing?
Yeah, it is a remarkable change, and you've probably all seen some of the reporting about the skies clearing, and we've been able to use remote sensing observations, for example, to see the large changes in NOx pollution over Asia and Europe and even over Los Angeles. And the impacts of those changes are really profound, particularly for air quality. So in places like Europe and Asia, where pollution levels have been quite high, especially Southern Europe and India and China, I think it's likely that there's a whole generation of people who are experiencing sustained good air quality for the first times in their lives. So there clearly are large impacts of this on local effects such as air pollution. I think when we think about the larger context, though, in terms of industrial activities that are leading to global warming, for example, in some ways, this just illustrates again the challenges that are ahead of us. This year we'll have almost certainly a large increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It will be imperceptibly smaller than it would have been absent these wrenching economic impacts. And so even though we see these huge changes, the effects on global warming are going to be quite modest. And I think, again, it just illustrates how that pathway to reducing global warming is going to come through science and technology and policies around building a new energy system for the globe, one that does not emit carbon. It's not that we're going to curtail economic activity. It's that we're going to enjoy economic activity at the same time that we limit our carbon emissions. And it's definitely doable. But I think this experiment once again illustrates the challenges associated with those events.
So, Paul, you talked about the clearing skies and the air pollution, and yet, when I look at my iPhone, it tells me the the air is unhealthy in Los Angeles. So how do I reconcile those two?
Yeah, so that is, it's kind of shocking, isn't it? I mean, today will likely give you another such warning, and probably tomorrow. I remember when the experiment first happened, and we saw in the Los Angeles Times the reporting about how all of a sudden the air quality is great in LA. Those of us who have been studying this look at that and say, oh, it was one of the rainiest Aprils in the last decade, and rain is associated with clearing of the air. And so we all joked and said, next week will be the paper report that says the traffic is down, but the air pollution is back. What's going on? And in fact, that's what's happened, right? Air pollution is very much of a local question. And in Los Angeles, for example, NOx pollution, which is one of the key ingredients of smog, those levels have dropped by more than a factor of 2 in the last decade. And yet over this last period, we have really not had any changes that are obvious in ozone pollution or in aerosol pollution. And so we've known for quite some time that the mobile fleet in particular in the United States is really quite clean. This is a tribute to California's air quality policies that go back to the 50s and 60s, as well as the Clean Air Act. So in the United States, the change in traffic has had a modest impact on air quality. But for example, in Asia or in Europe, where the mobile fleet contributes much more significantly to air quality, we are seeing large changes, and that's, again, as anticipated.
That's right. So just as Pamela finished with the big picture looking forward, what do you see as the area society can explore and do differently as we come out of this pandemic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll be very curious to see how many of the changes that have happened will be lasting, in the sense of, are we going to, as a community, travel less for work? I can think of just the enormous amount of air travel that has not occurred, but yet we're still having our conferences, we're still doing events like this one. Is that going to be the new normal, and how will that change our calculus around environmental impacts? I think there's going to be a pretty substantial economic stimulus associated with what's happened in the economics of the world. Will we use that stimulus to positively impact the energy system, our transportation systems, in a way that produce lasting and important changes in the environment? I sure hope so.
Oh, thank you. So as we talk about applying lessons learned, taking this experience and moving forward, there's an outstanding example provided by engineers at JPL, which Caltech manages for NASA. Throughout its history, the lab has demonstrated its ability to take innovations and technologies developed for space exploration and translate them into solutions from everything from robotic-assisted surgery to camera-on-chip technology and cell phones. Dave, just earlier this month, you were invited to the White House to discuss a simpler and lower-cost ventilator that JPL's engineers developed specifically to respond to this pandemic. Talk about pivoting in that way. So tell us about this project, and also, for the curious among us, your experience at the White House.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, it was, first of all, the overwhelming comment that I would make is just the sense of pride of the people, the men and women of JPL and of Caltech, and of what people can accomplish in a very short amount of time if they put their minds to it. So yeah, in roughly 4.5 to 5 weeks, from a couple of people talking in the cafeteria about the pandemic and what could we do to help, and the shortage of ventilators, to 5 weeks later, standing in the cabinet room showing the president a prototype of the ventilator. And then a few days after that, we were granted FDA approval, and Caltech has offered royalty-free licensing. We had over 200 companies apply to build the ventilators. We've down selected a little bit to roughly a dozen in the US and a dozen overseas. Huge interest from overseas, from Brazil, from Mexico, from UAE, from India. And you know, it's really a story of people right in the middle of working remotely, honestly, 12 to 14 hours a day, figuring out how to solve problems and how to apply the engineering skills that we normally apply to spacecraft and science instruments to building a ventilator. It's a simplified ventilator. It has 75, 80 components, whereas a normal ICU ventilator may have 1,000 components. It's a high pressure ventilator designed specifically for coronavirus patients that require intubation and have less compliant lungs that need more pressure. On the second day of development, we got frontline hospitals in New York and other places around the country, as well as the FDA involved. So by the time we had the working prototype, it was not a big stretch to get FDA approval and get testing done at Mount Sinai in New York. That process of, you know, coming up with a design for a complex piece of medical equipment and getting it approved is probably a 3 or 4 year process under normal circumstances. Of course, I'm trying to figure out how can we apply what we learned to how we build spacecraft and see if we can ramp that up. But it's an incredible success story. The trip to the White House was unexpected. I would say that, you know, I have enormous respect for the office of the president, regardless of who the occupant of that office at a given time is. And to be able to go in and provide that briefing, I spent about a half an hour with the Director of National Intelligence and the National Security Advisor prior to Mr. Trump coming in, and it was intended to be a closed briefing, and he walked over and we made some small talk, which is an intimidating thing, and he asked if we had a good story here, and I told him in the midst of this pandemic, I think it's a tremendous, you know, kind of feel good winning story of persistence and creativity. So he turned around, and it was supposed to be a closed briefing, and he told the press secretary, said, "Bring in the media." And of course, then, you know, 30 people came in the room, and that was somewhat alarming to me. But it was a great experience. You know, I'd never been in the West Wing. I'd done some briefings kind of in the executive office building, but never in the West Wing. And of course, I got to get a COVID test as a part of that. So anyway, it was quite a enjoyable and slightly terrifying experience. But just in the end, the pride over JPL and Caltech and people coming together. You know, there were these WebExes with 40 people on them, you know, day after day after day, and design reviews. The doctors would come out of the ICU at Mount Sinai and jump on the design review, and yeah, it was incredible. So thank you for asking.
That's great. You mentioned spacecraft. You have a rover to send to Mars in July. Can you tell us how that's doing?
Well, yeah, as you know, when you asked me earlier about pivoting, we do have a lot of other things still going on, and it's actually incredible with just that small percentage of people being physically at JPL, how well we've been able to stay on track with a lot of our projects. The most high profile and important of which is the Mars 2020 mission, which was just recently renamed Perseverance, is actually at the Cape in Florida preparing for launch. The launch window opens July 17th. We have been able to stay on schedule in the midst of all of this, and still, I mean, it's incredible actually, being very, very careful with the employees that are in Florida working on that and how we keep them isolated and everything else. Employee safety comes first. What's particularly fun about Perseverance is, first of all, it's carrying a little 2-kilogram helicopter, which also has just been renamed. It's called Ingenuity, and this is the first time a helicopter or any other UAV has flown outside of the Earth. Mars has about 1% atmosphere of the Earth, so there's not a lot for the blades to push against. This thing will fly for a couple of minutes at a time and scout ahead, and runs off solar power. The other thing that's fun about Perseverance is it's going to cache samples for later retrieval by the Mars Sample Return mission. So we've got Perseverance going on. We've got the Europa Clipper mission, which is going to one of the moons of Jupiter, Europa, which is what we believe is the most likely place to harbor life outside of the Earth in our solar system. We've got Psyche, a mission to a metal asteroid. I mean, I could go on, as you know, and but I will stop there and say we have a lot of fun things going on, and amazingly, the employees and the engineers and scientists and administrators and business people have been quite effective working from home. It's quite exciting. Thank you.
Very exciting indeed. So I wanted to wrap up with some discussion of the intersection of science and society. If you think of some of the past instances in human history, like the bubonic plague, we don't worry about that anymore because actually we came up with cures. So I wanted to get your sense of all of you about the obligations and opportunities we have right now to deepen the awareness of the role and importance of science and engineering in everyday life, not just when crises come up.
Well, I think we have an obligation to continue to do basic research on how viruses transmit from animals to people. If we don't do this and don't fund it properly, this is going to happen again. It could be even worse. I mean, if you could imagine something that's as transmissible as SARS-CoV-2, but has the fatality rate of SARS, conventional or classical SARS or MERS, 35% of the people infected would be dead. So unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of investment recently, and some of it's actually been cut off in the basic research that's needed for understanding the transmission, zoonotic transmission, it's what it's called, from animals to people. And we absolutely have to continue to do that, or I think we're not going to be ready for the next pandemic.
Yeah, I do think that the prominence that this community has right now is something we need to help to just move that needle in terms of bringing science and technology to the fore in our country and in the world, really to show that it has this potential to make things a lot better for a lot of people. And I sure hope that happens. I'm thankful for forums such as this one, where we have an opportunity to explain what we're doing and why it's so vital.
All right, Dave?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of our charter at JPL is to take the U.S. and the world, frankly, on this journey of exploration. And we only talked about the ventilator, but we also have done work on virus inactivation. We've done a bunch of open source PPE for respirators. I think something that I've taken away is that we need to consider if we should take some small percentage of our work, even though we're NASA's lab, should we take some small percentage of our workforce and our talent and our creativity and apply it to finding medical solutions to really tough problems? So that's something I'm taking to the Executive Council, and I know you'll hear about, Tom.
Great, thank you. So one final question, and we'll then open this conversation up to questions from the audience. So this is the lightning round. Just briefly, if you could tell me, in this time of crisis, what has brought each of you hope?
The way the scientific community has come together, it's remarkable.
Yeah, the rapid pivot to new ways of discovery, just to see the faculty, the students, and the postdocs, everyone fully engaged in their work is really wonderful. I think it provides a sense of hope for the resilience of our efforts.
Yeah, the easy answer would be to say that the ventilator and what we accomplished. I would also say, on a personal note, we had our 2 grandsons as part of our sort of germ tribe, if you will. And when the news is just every day is darker than the previous day, that perspective of seeing new life and joy and all that has been very helpful for myself and my family.
Well, thank you all for sharing your insights and for your important work during this pandemic. I'm sure that members of the audience also have questions. And if you have questions for Pamela, Paul, or Dave, you can send them to us via the control panel. Jessica is going to join us now to share your questions, and we'll try to get to them, as many of them as we can. Jessica, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I will get started right away. Pamela, this first one is for you. This is from a student from Verdugo Hills High School. And he asks, what novel biological mechanisms have been observed with the COVID-19 virus? And what does the emergence of such an unexpectedly debilitating virus indicate about possible future epidemics and the direction of epidemiology moving forward? I think he's going to be working with you soon.
Okay, that's great. So I really like it when high school students and junior high and grade school kids get interested in in any type of science. It's really wonderful. So thanks for your question. I think there's a lot of similarities in this SARS, that is SARS-2, to the classical SARS or to MERS or to other respiratory diseases. But what is different about it is that it spreads when it's not before there are symptoms. And SARS and MERS did not do that. And so that's part of the reason we have such a high infection rate worldwide today. I don't have any idea why that is. It would be really interesting to try and devise experiments to figure out why. But to me, that's the most surprising thing. There's nothing you can pinpoint. I mean, we have the whole genetic sequence of all the different variants of SARS-CoV-2. We have a lot of SARS variants and MERS and so on, and common cold coronavirus variants. You cannot look at those sequences and figure out what makes them more or less transmissible. I mean, there are guesses, but I don't understand that. I find it really interesting, and I think it's difficult to figure that out. That's one of the big problems with this current pandemic, is the fact that it's transmissible before people have symptoms.
Thank you so much. This next one is for Paul. What are you noticing about air quality in China now that the economy is starting to reopen?
Yeah, it's coming roaring back. Air pollution has a time constant of just a couple of days. So as soon as the activity spins up again, things go back to the way they were before, unfortunately. But what you always hope, of course, is that people don't, that they remember what they have seen and experienced, and will demand the kind of policy changes that have made such a difference in Los Angeles.
Thank you. And back to Pamela. Is there any information why some people have no symptoms with COVID and others escalate into multi-system organ failure, ventilation, and death? Is it the immune system, how they were infected, or genetic?
Well, that's an easy one to answer because no one knows. I will say that there is evidence that actually men have a worse problem with after infection than women on average. So there's something going on there. It's not clear exactly what it is, but there's some attempts to treat men who are in the ICU with estrogen patches temporarily, so it might be a hormonal thing. I think that it's your immune system that causes the disease, really. It's not the virus, because sometimes there is no detectable infectious virus in a person when they have progressed to this ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. It is the immune system that has responded to all the damage in the lungs from having the virus there, and then it spreads systemically throughout the body. why does that happen to some people? It's not just older people. It can be young people as well. There's very strange clotting problems in young people. There have been strokes. Young people have had strange episodes with really low blood pressure and rapid heart rates that are like heart failure. There may be a genetic component. I think that perhaps this can be figured out from data in Iceland, where everyone's entire genome has been sequenced, and they also know who has been infected with SARS-CoV-2. So perhaps by analyzing that huge data set, something could be figured out. But the answer right now is no one knows, and it's an excellent question, but no one knows the answer to that.
Thank you. This one's for Dave and probably for Dr. Rosenbaum as well. Are Caltech and JPL communicating with similar overseas research institutes? If yes, which are potentially the best partners?
I'll let Tom answer the part about research institutes, and I'll just go back to what I said earlier, that we've had enormous interest from Brazil, Mexico, India, in getting ventilator technology to them and getting ventilators built for what they believe is already is actually in several of those places a surge which they cannot come close to accommodating. I'll let Tom take a cut at the research question.
Sure. One of the wonderful things about science is that it's an international endeavor. I mean, we routinely talk to colleagues abroad throughout the world. Certainly, electronic technology has made that easier. And we wind up with collaborations. 45% of the faculty at Caltech were born outside of this country. So these connections are deep and strong. I'm not sure I want to pick a favorite endeavor or institution, but it's certainly true that to solve this problem, this is going to take an international effort.
Thank you so much. Paul, we're getting a lot of questions about, once we are out of our lockdown, how can these changes that we've seen, how can we continue to sustain them? Are there policies or behaviors that humans can continue to improve our air quality and our environment?
Yeah, I mean, through the inventiveness of people and getting the policies set the right way, I think there's a great hope for sustained improvements in the global environment. I think this particular episode illustrates some of the more straightforward ways that can happen. For example, in India and China and Europe, where addressing the automobile and really the types of things that have been done in Los Angeles for a long time could make a very, very big difference. In terms of climate, I think it illustrates once again this profound change we need in how we generate the power that will power the world going forward. It's not simply that we need to use less, it's that we just need a profoundly different source of energy. And these are coming, but I'm hopeful that with the rethinking about how large changes can really impact people, maybe this would be another one. Let's bend the curve on climate. Let's use this as a real opportunity to think about and do big things that are within our grasp.
I like that. Bend the curve on the climate. Pamela, how large would a phase 3 trial have to be in terms of number of patients and duration of trial to get significant findings for both safety and efficacy?
Okay, so this is quite outside of what I do because I do basic research. I've never conducted any type of human clinical trial. I will say that phase 1 is the safety part of it. Phase 2 would be efficacy, and then does it, for example, raise the type of immune responses that you want it to raise? So you can look at that using, to establish what are the correlates of protection. So if you know that, then you look for those in the people who've received the potential vaccine. Phase 3 would be you have to have a control group who gets the vaccine and a control group who doesn't get the vaccine and another group who does, and then you wait for them to get exposed. So it depends on what area you're going to pick those people from. If it's from a place where everybody's getting infected, or a lot of people are, you could do that number to see if it was statistically significant, if the vaccine worked a lot quicker. That's a little bit depressing though, because that's assuming that there are areas where a substantial portion of the population is getting infected. So I'm afraid I can't give you any real numbers. I think it's incredibly important to make absolutely sure, however, before a vaccine is given to potentially 50% of the world's population, that it is completely safe. And so that's where I think a lot of work has to be done. It's very promising so far, but I think they need a lot more people in these trials. And then there's over 100 different vaccine candidates right now. Obviously, one can't do phase 3 clinical trials on all 120 or whatever it is. There's more every day.
Thank you. For Dave, what do you think are the challenges of the creative development of technology when workers are working remotely from each other?
You know, I'll answer it in the following way. There's been a lot of kind of, you know, discussion, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that we've been so effective working from home that we're going to have trouble getting our employees to come back to JPL. The piece, sort of the secret sauce, if you will, of JPL that's, you know, made us successful over 50 years. Part of that is the collaboration that happens on the mall, that happens in the cafeteria, dropping by people's offices. That does not happen on WebEx or Zoom or, you know, Google Meetings, whatever your platform is. It's possible, but it's less serendipitous and it's less effective. The other piece of it is there are things like with the prototyping, even though it was a small percentage of the team, you actually have to have people testing designs, connecting up cables, running performance tests in person in a lab. And so those are sort of some of the challenges, but it does have us looking at, are there ways that we can, you know, tilt a little bit more towards work from home?
Thank you. Paul, is there a correlation with local weather and cleaner air? How does the current situation affect the microclimate in, for example, Los Angeles?
So, absolutely. I mean, the weather is, especially in the springtime, is the first order importance in terms of air quality. And so you'll probably have noticed, if you're living in Los Angeles, that those alerts come on the hot sunny days, and that's no surprise. The reason it's sunny, we have air pollution is driven by photolysis from the sun, and then the temperatures tell us something about how the basin meteorology is working. So the hot days are the days when the air is not moving in and out of the basin very quickly, and so pollution gets to accumulate. So that's what makes actually the diagnosis of air quality from this kind of changes, as large as they have been, really difficult, because the springtime in particular, we have this large changes in the meteorology, and then they drive large changes in the air pollution independent of what the traffic is doing.
Thank you. Dr. Rosenbaum, I think this one is for you, and of course all my questions just moved, so give me 1 second, sorry. Dr. Rosenbaum, how can we encourage more young people in the US to enter science? Many universities and private corporations rely on talent from overseas because US-born students do not enter the science arena as a career. Why is this? How can we change this reluctance?
Well, that's a multi-layered question, which doesn't, there's not an easy answer. There are lots of interventions. I think one thing is that we don't really explain the joys of science to young people, that it really is understanding the world around you. But if you take little kids and do science clubs with them, you know, kindergarten, first, second, third grade, they love it. They love science. They love exploring. They're natural scientists. And we have to somehow keep that model in mind as we move through courses later in life. I think also the role of research. The reason to come to Caltech, by the way, is to do research as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, as a faculty member, because you're creating knowledge, which has this remarkable gratification when you understand something in a deep way. You hope it's important, but just the gratification from being a person who understands how things around you are constructed is enormous. And so I think the key is really to be able to communicate the joys of being a scientist, as well, of course, as the need of society for people well-versed in science and technology.
Thank you so much. Paul, this one is for you. And sorry, my questions keep bumping around. There's so many coming in. For a climate change career, is engineering the best degree? If so, what focus is best? And this questioner says her daughter is going to Olin College after the fall, or in the fall.
Oh, congratulations. Yeah. There are so many important avenues to, I mean, the climate question is going to be central to so many aspects of science, technology, economics, everything in the next decades. And so you should find the passion you have, find the area that makes you excited to get to work, to think about and pursue those, because there are so many different avenues and they all have impact. There are those people who want to work by themselves in the laboratory, and there are those who want to collaborate in engineering the next solar panels. So there's just enormous opportunity here, and I hope, and it sounds like her daughter's off to a great place to explore some of those.
Thank you so much. Dave, has JPL attempted the use of crowdsourcing for any of the tasks you've undertaken, given the number of people working from home with ample screen time and a desire to engage in problem solving?
In a sense, we crowdsourced from within JPL, but I don't think, amazingly, there weren't a bunch of sort of first of a kind physics problems to solve. It was a matter of coming up with something practical that doesn't steal from the supply chain from medical device companies. There was a group of 3 people that came up with a device called I think it's called the Pulse Pendant. Has a little IR sensor here, and if you raise your hands to touch your face, I was going to say shocks you. It pulses you to remind you not to touch your face, and it costs it costs like 60 cents to make this thing, and they've now put that out as completely open source. So in a sense, it was crowdsourced from inside JPL. Big NASA had their own kind of call for good ideas, but it all happened so quickly. We didn't really do anything from outside, and frankly, we funded all of this work kind of from the internal investment fund at JPL. There wasn't really time to get money from FEMA or anywhere else.
Thank you. Paul, this is from another student. Is there any information, sorry, has the pandemic impacted the production of polluting gases from agricultural practices and livestock?
That's a great question, and we really don't know the answer to that right now. Even from the energy sector, for example, we are hoping to get some JPL instrumentation off the ground pretty soon to go out and explore just these kinds of questions, but we don't know. But it's a great question.
For Pamela, is there any information about why some children develop multi-system inflammatory syndrome? And that's also from a Verdugo Hills High School student.
These are great questions, and I think one part of being a scientist is being willing to admit when you don't know. The entire field doesn't know. This is like the weirdest thing that just arose relatively recently, where they started noticing these very strong inflammatory responses in children like 14 and under. There aren't that many of them so far, but it's incredibly scary what happens to them. And it appears to happen after they've recovered from whatever mild symptoms they had from COVID-19. I don't have any idea what could cause that. I haven't heard anyone say they know either. So this is going to take a lot more research. And one of the problems, I think, is that there's no really good animal model for COVID-19 disease. There are various animals, including non-human primates, that will be infected with this virus, but they don't reproduce all the symptoms that are seen in humans. So it's going to be very hard to answer that. My understanding is when children have gotten those incredible inflammatory responses, they have been so far, I think, successfully treated with steroids. So I have not heard yet of any children dying of that, although children have, a few young people have died of this infection.
Thank you. Dr. Rosenbaum, I'll direct this one to you because you might know the landscape at Caltech. Is Caltech assessing new public transportation models that will lessen likelihood of viruses transmitting? And I guess this could be, you know, metros and buses, but also airplane, air travel as well.
You know, our faculty is enormously inventive, so someone may be doing something along these lines, but I'm not familiar with it. Clearly, social distancing is going to be with us for a while, so it's a very important problem and question.
Yeah. Dave, is just a follow-up to that. I mean, how do astronauts deal with this when they're in space? Maybe things, I guess, probably don't survive, but how is bacteria and things like that dealt with in air travel, airspace travel?
I'm going to take the liberty to re-vector your question a little bit. JPL's charter is really everything but humans in space. We do a small amount of testing and things like that. But what I will say is, so our charter is really robotic exploration of space. But one of the things we're doing at Mars, and one of the things we want to do at Europa is look for life. And so we actually spend a very significant effort to make sure that we have extraordinary cleanliness on our spacecraft before they launch. The worst case scenario is you go to Mars and get the front page of the New York Times because we've discovered life, and we discovered the life that we brought there. So we do spend a lot of effort on planetary protection and making sure that we don't introduce any biology to other planets.
Thank you. This will be my final question, but it is to all three of you. So Pamela, maybe I'll start with you. Has COVID-19 been one of the hardest research projects you have had to look into in such little time compared to any other virus?
Honestly, no. I would say HIV would be much harder. Everything about HIV is much more difficult. That virus stays in people. If they're not treated, they can survive for decades with a waning immune system, but they still survive. That virus is much more adapted to cause a very long-term infection. And so it's got a lot more tricks up its sleeve, let's say. It's been selected to have a lot more. It's going to be very hard to ever get an effective treatment other than multiple drugs delivered at once, which is the current treatment. This virus, like I said, I think scientifically it should be relatively easy to design an effective vaccine. It just has to be proven to be safe. And then there's some issue about whether or not there would be immunological memory, so that you would, it's possible you would have to get the vaccine delivered to you every year, somewhat like an annual flu vaccine. That's given to you every year because there are different strains of flu circulating, but maybe there wouldn't be that many different isolates of SARS-CoV-2 circulating. It appears to mutate not as fast as flu, but maybe you don't develop strong immunological memory. We certainly don't have strong immunological memory to common colds. We keep getting them over and over again. But it's not that bad to think of. What if you had to take an annual vaccine for SARS-CoV-2? I think everyone that I know would just do that.
Thank you so much. Paul?
Well, I'd say that, you know, this is an acute thing. obviously, and profoundly important. But in terms of the societal impacts for the long term, I think what we're doing to the planet by driving up the greenhouse gas concentrations is something that's going to be with us for the next century, or if not even longer. And so while this certainly is an acute event right now, I think the chronic illness that the planet's going to feel if we continue doing what we're doing to the greenhouse gases is the real huge challenge we have for the next decades.
Thank you. Dave?
Yeah, I would say people come to JPL to solve incredibly hard problems and face difficult challenges. There's on the front wall of our headquarters building is the "Dare Mighty Things" quote from Roosevelt, and this is certainly strained people on a personal level. That I would say that it has not been tremendously different, even on the ventilator project, as kind of the press that goes on, in the last couple of months before something launches. So it's been very difficult. People are home with their kids with no childcare and trying to do virtual meetings and homeschool and everything else. But it's been hard, but I would say it's in family with some of the other things that we faced.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rosenbaum, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you.
This has been a wonderful discussion. Actually gives me great hope. Thank you to the panelists, to the audience for those great questions, and to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. If you're interested in learning more about the science of viruses or other topics, what we know and what we don't know, please visit Caltech's Science Exchange. This is a new initiative with multimedia content that's intended for a general audience. Science Exchange, one word, .caltech.edu. Now back to Kim.
Thank you all. That was such an amazing discussion. Thank you all for your time. Please let all of your colleagues at Caltech and JPL know how much we appreciate all of your critical research and your breakthrough technologies. I love the ventilator story. And of course, we're all going to be cheering you on in July with Perseverance. So thank you all so much. We have some terrific live streams this week and next that I just want to quickly highlight. Thursday, we have Politics Professor Dan Schnurr on politics in the time of coronavirus. Friday, we have a special program with the RAND Corporation on truth decay and disinformation. And next week, we have a young professionals program focusing on the political case for universal basic income. June 4th, we have Congressman Adam Schiff in conversation with Dan Schnurr on how the nation has responded to COVID-19. And on June 9th, we have a conversation with the ambassador to Germany, Dr. Emily Haber, with moderator Ambassador John Emerson, chairman of the American Council on Germany. So you can check out all of our upcoming listings on your control panel. Just click on the word handout. And of course, we all would love to have you all back later for an update on all of your great breakthroughs. And to our viewing audience, please visit our website at lawac.org to see how you can continue to support us to bring terrific programs like today's. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon.